The entire nation of Israel, which at the time was Jacob's family, had been rescued by Joseph and taken to Egypt. We've been talking about that over the last few weeks. 30 years later, Joseph has apparently died, and apparently there's a new Pharaoh in Egypt. And the Jews are made into slaves. They serve as slaves for the next 400 years until God sends Moses back to Egypt to set them free. Through Moses, God brought plagues upon Egypt to break the will of the Pharaoh. He finally sends a death angel who will take the life of every firstborn who is not protected, covered by the blood of a lamb. The Jews were to each get a lamb for a family or a goat, and for a week they had to check the goat or lamb out to make sure it was without blemish. It couldn't have any kind of blemish on it. Then they were to kill it and put the blood on their doorposts. They were to roast the lamb with fire and eat it. When the death angel came through Egypt, it would pass over the homes that were protected by the blood of the lamb. God then made the Passover an annual memorial. We celebrate Passover every year on the Sunday nearest to the Passover Jewish date and just before Easter. Passover is now often called communion or the Lord's Supper. It was an annual event, therefore we do it annually. To do it otherwise departs from the biblical intention. Jesus did not say, do this often. He said, as often as you do it in remembrance of me. Passover was a picture of what Jesus would do for us. He had to be the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, had to be without blemish. He had to be sinless. Of course, the Bible tells us he was tempted as we are, yet without sin. His blood had to be shed, and it has to be applied in order to save us. The lamb was to be roasted with fire, which is a picture of Jesus suffering our hell and hell's fiery judgment. And then they ate the lamb, which is a picture of now how Christ lives in us through his Spirit. I'm calling this Christ our Passover. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. There it says, clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened, for Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. You may not know, but the use of the term leaven is almost always used to describe sin. In the festivals the Jews would celebrate, they always would use unleavened bread. They were to get the sin out. In biblical times, wine could mean anything. When you see the word wine in the New Testament, it could mean anything from a squeezed grape, juice just came out, to something that we would today call an alcoholic beverage, even though an alcoholic beverage in that day was nothing like they are in our day. One of the qualifications for a pastor, our translation says not to be addicted to wine. What it says is he's not to sit long at wine. Why? Because in that day, the alcoholic content to wine was so minimal. It was like a soft drink today. You'd have to drink a whole lot of it to ever get drunk. So a pastor couldn't sit long at wine. If you go to a foreign country today, one of the first things you're going to be told is, don't drink the water. So this is what they had to drink. You don't drink the water in a country today that has a system where they try to purify water. How much more so in a day when no such system existed. So they'd take the juice and they would add leaven to it to help it, to preserve it, and then that's what would give it the tad of a alcoholic content. But again, not anywhere close to beer or anything else that people drink today. Also, if you read the Gospels, you'll discover that when they did the Passover, communion, Lord's Supper, the word wine is never used. Interesting. It says they used the fruit of the vine, and in most cases it said they drank from the cup. The cup. A great thing for you to do this Easter season is to read each of the gospel accounts of Jesus from Passover through Gethsemane, through the trials, through his death, burial, resurrection, And you can find these accounts in Matthew 26, verse 1 through 28, verse 20, the rest of the book. So anyway, read those passages, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then today, there are two things I want to recognize about what we call Passover, Communion, or Lord's Supper. They're in your outline. Number one, his body, Jesus' body, would be broken for us. Jesus was beaten nearly to death by the whips of the Romans. He was blindfolded and slugged in the face. He was crucified, where they drove spikes through his hands and his feet, and they pierced his side with a spear. His body was broken for us. Number two, his blood would be shed for us. You can read the account of the first Passover in Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 22. And then in Leviticus 16, 1 to 34, you can read the instructions that God gave Israel for how to celebrate the Passover. Christ, our Passover, would shed his blood. Notice what Jesus said in John 15, 13. Greater love has no one than this, that one would lay down his life for his friends. In the ultimate act of love, Jesus laid down his life for us. After Jesus celebrated Passover with his disciples, he made known to them during that time that the broken bread was a picture of his body that was broken, and that the cup pictured his blood that would be shed for them. So by his death, God would pass over our sin. After they had Passover, they proceeded eventually to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. In your outline, the word Gethsemane means to crush. It literally means to crush. There's a wheel that goes around crushing the grapes. It's called Gethsemane. And God, it tells us in Isaiah 53:10 that God the Father was pleased to crush Jesus so that he could save us. We'll read that verse later. Think about that. The Father was pleased to crush his sinless Son in order to have you. Now, one of the things we want as human beings, we want to be wanted, don't we? It's one thing to be needed, but we want to be wanted. Nobody will ever go to that extent because they want you. Nobody will ever want you like God wants you. Under that, number one, Jesus' soul was grieved to the point of death there in Gethsemane. Jesus is the God-man. Being God, he knows what he's about to go through. He knows the future. But being a man, he suffered as a man. Remember, he got hungry just like we did. He got tired just like we do. And as a man, he was grieved literally to the point of death. Number two, Jesus sweat drops of blood from the stress. The medical term for this is hematidrosis. It can occur when people are under enormous amounts of stress. And so their sweat, it comes out with blood in it. It's red. Number three, Jesus had to be strengthened by an angel. That's how massive this was, this burden, this weight he was carrying. Because of the enormity of what he was about to go, an angel appears to him and gives him strength. Number four, Jesus had to drink the cup. There was no other way. He had to drink the cup. There was no other way. So if you remember, 3 times he said, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Not what I will, though, but what you will. 3 times God said, no, this cup cannot pass. Jesus had to drink the cup of God's wrath against our sin, or we did. He had to suffer hell, or we did. Jesus had to drink the cup. Now, he didn't have to in the sense, he could have said, to hell with all of you, you all deserve it. And he would have been holy, righteous, good, and just. But that's not what he did. He drank the cup. Jesus wasn't trying to get out of the suffering he was about to face. This is put in Scripture, so every time we read this story, we would go, this is unthinkable. He's going to drink this cup for me. The one who doesn't deserve hell, obviously more than anybody else, has no issue of deserving hell. is going to suffer hell for somebody who deserves it. What kind of love is that? What kind of sacrifice is that? Jesus wanted to know that there was no other way. He suffers hell, or we do. So for our sake, he had to suffer hell. He had to drink the cup. While Jesus was in the garden, Judas arrives with soldiers to complete his betrayal of Jesus. And we learn four things about the betrayal. First of all, Jesus is the I am. Jesus is the I am. Remember when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush? Moses said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am that I am." I am. That's where you get the word Yahweh or Jehovah from the Hebrew consonants. So in the garden, the soldiers come up and Jesus said, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "We've come to arrest Jesus." And Jesus says, watch this, he says, "I am." Now your translation will add the word he. It should be in italics, which means it's not in the Greek text. Jesus didn't say, "I am he." He didn't say, "I am that person." He didn't say, "I am the one." He said, "I am." And does anybody remember what happened when he said that? The soldiers were blown back to the ground. It was like a mighty wind just knocked them all down. And all they did was say, "I am." Jesus is the I am. Number two, Jesus is betrayed by a kiss. Judas confirms that this was Jesus by betraying him with a kiss. Look at the words of Proverbs 27, verse 6. "Faithful are the wounds of a friend," the person who tells you something that might be hard to hear because they love you, "but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy." Jesus is betrayed by a kiss. Number three, Jesus chose to go to the cross. He chose to go to the cross. The soldiers did not arrest Jesus against his will. They arrested him in accordance with his will. They were doing his will when they arrested him. We saw last week that God can use even the wrath of man to accomplish his plan. Look what he said earlier in John 10:17 and verse 18. "I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one is taking it from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again." Jesus said, nobody can take my life from me. I'm the I am. But I can lay it down, and I can take it back up. Number four, Jesus could have called 12 legions of angels. He could have called 12 legions of angels. Matthew tells us that actually he could have called more than 12 legions of angels to rescue him. In the Old Testament, one angel on one night killed 186,000 people. One angel, one night, 186,000 people. A legion is 6,000 people. 12 legions is 72,000 angels. Multiply 72,000 angels times the ability to kill 186,000 in an instant. Jesus could have called angels and wiped the whole human race out. But he didn't do it, did he? Why? Because they weren't taking his life from him. He was giving it for them. He said he would take it up again. And sure enough, he will. After Jesus was arrested, he went through a series of trials before Jewish religious leaders. Herod Antipas, who was the Jewish king, who basically was a guy who served under the Roman government, and the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Herod Antipas is the Herod who beheaded John the Baptist. Pilate considered Jesus to be innocent of any kind of crimes, but he consented to have Jesus crucified because there was about to be a political incident and possibly a riot. He didn't want that on his record. So Pilate washed his hands in front of him, saying that he was innocent of this man's blood. Listen to this. Don't miss this. Think about history. The mob of Jews said, "His blood be on us and on our children." His blood be on us Jews, and their children. You have to wonder if the problems faced by the Jews over these centuries have any connection to these words. His blood be on us and our children. And then we come to the crucifixion. Under that, number one, Jesus was hit and whipped by the Romans. He was blindfolded and hit in the face with fists. And then they would ask him, who struck you? If you're the Son of God, tell us which one of us hit you. He was dressed in a purple robe, and he was given a crown of thorns to mock him for claiming to be a king. Now, we have thorns here in East Tennessee on roses and stuff that are, what are they, maybe a 3/8 of an inch or something, if they're that big. We're talking about thorns that are 4 and 5 and 6 inches long. And they make a crown of him, they put him on his head, and then they beat his head with a reed. So they're beating these thorns into his skull. And then this is the most amazing thing at all to me. They spat upon the sacred face. That's about the most disrespectful thing you could ever do to a person, spit in their face. And here's the I am, the one who spoke and everything was, the one who could speak again and no one would be. And he lets puny man spit in his face. Say, why on earth would any God do that? Because that's how much he loves you. Not because you deserve it, but because that's who he is. They then whipped Jesus with a cat of 9 tails. So you'll see stuff say he got 39 lashes. The Bible doesn't say that. Paul got 39 lashes several times. But they whipped him with a cat of 9 tails. Now, a cat of 9 tails was a bull whip. It had one handle, and then there were 9 whips on it. And on the end of each of the whips was a piece of broken glass or pottery. And the whole intent was when you hit somebody with the whip, it would wrap around them and dig into their skin. And then you'd pull it off. So by the time Jesus went to the cross, the upper part of his body was shredded. It was a grotesque sight. There were probably people throwing up. People were probably passing out. It was a grotesque sight as the upper part of his body was just completely shedded. Why in the world would the I am, the one who spoke and all that is, allow puny men to wreak such havoc on his earthly body? Because he loves you that much. In our day, we have these sanitized paintings of Jesus on the cross. He's up on the cross. He's got a little blood trickling down from his crown, little blood trickling from his hands and his feet. It was nothing like that. Imagine a body up that somebody might as well taken a chainsaw and just zigzagged the whole upper part of it. Imagine all the blood pouring over and covering his face from the crown of thorns being penetrated into his skull from that reed beating him on the head. And Jesus was, as we say in our day, he was beaten to a pulp, covered with blood, could barely walk because of the torture and the loss of blood. Which brings us to number 2. Simon of Cyrene carried his cross. Jesus was crucified with 2 thieves. And normally when they executed people, the person being executed had to carry the cross up to the place of execution. But you know, Jesus collapsed under the weight of the cross. Why? He was already beaten almost to death. And so he falls to the ground. They get this Simon Cyrene and order him to carry the cross. Number 3, Jesus is crucified at Golgotha or Calvary. He's crucified at Golgotha or Calvary. It tells us it was on a place called the place of the skull. The Aramaic name for the place of the skull is Golgotha. The Latin name for the place of the skull is Calvary. So that's where the word Calvary comes from. We have a photo of the hill just outside of Jerusalem's old city right there. As you can see, it definitely looks like the face of a skull. In Psalm 22, verses 1 to 8, is a prophecy of the crucifixion of Jesus. And there, as you read it, you see the crucifixion of Jesus described in incredible detail by David. Watch this, who's never seen a crucifixion. So he's writing as if he's there at the cross, but he's never seen a crucifixion. How can he do that? Because every word in the Bible is God inspired. It's written by God who had seen the crucifixion, who had been there. Jesus is crucified at Golgotha. Number 4, Jesus is nailed to his cross. He's nailed to his cross. Barely alive, they bring him get to the place of the skull, and they nail him to the cross. Now, when they nail him to the cross, they don't use nails as we know, 16 pennies, some. They use big spikes, and they put them at the bottom of the hand and the wrist. If you put one through your palm, your hand would tear out from the weight of your body. So it goes right here at the base of your hand and the wrist, and then they would double their feet over and drive one through their feet. Now, the way crucifixion works is you hang there, and the longer you hang there, the more trauma your body takes. You start getting fluid around your heart, on your lungs. You start to suffocate. That's how you normally die, from suffocating. And then as you hang there, these muscles atrophy or they tear. And the only way you can eventually get another breath is you've got to either pull up off your hands or push up off that nail through your feet, get a breath, and go back down. And then when you have to do it again, you got to push up again and get a breath and go back down. And then when you're too weak to do it the next time, you suffocate and die. In our day, we have the death penalty, still takes place some places. And it's always, the means of doing it is always designed to create the least amount of pain for the person who's going to die. So basically, we want it to be like putting a dog down. You won't feel anything, you'll just be gone. We try to make it as painless as possible. The Roman crucifixion was just the opposite. The whole point was to make it as painful as possible, as horrible as it could possibly be. And of course, that's indeed what they did. Number 5, Jesus is mocked by all. So Jesus is hanging on the cross. The mob there is mocking him. The 2 men crucified with him are both mocking him. He claimed to save others. Let him save himself. If you're the Son of God, come down from that cross. Mark tells us that both of the thieves were mocking him. But then something changed. We come to number 6. One thief recognized Jesus and repented. While they're hanging there, and this thief has watched Jesus through this whole ordeal, he recognizes Jesus really is who he claims to be. And he asks Jesus to remember him in his kingdom. And if you remember, Jesus said, "This very day you will be with me in paradise." Number 7, Jesus suffered God's wrath for our sin. Jesus suffered God's wrath for our sin. Mel Gibson made a movie that really adequately depicts the crucifixion and beating of Jesus. It's a gory thing. Most of you, I assume, have seen it. If you haven't, you need to. But that's not really what saved us from our sin. Our sin debt wasn't owed to the Romans. Our sin debt wasn't owed to the Jews. Our sin debt wasn't owed to the devil. Our sin debt was owed to God. It was owed to God. And so for us, God has to do something. In Mark 15:33-34, it tells us that between noon and 3 p.m., that the sky grew pitch dark, grew black. It's at this time that Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's likely that this is the time that Jesus literally suffers our hell there on the cross. What is hell? Hell is the absence of God. God is everything good comes from God. And so all you have to do is just like light. What is darkness? Darkness is the absence of light. If we turn the lights out, this room goes pitch dark. And hell is the absence of good because God isn't there. And so Jesus suffers the complete absence of everything that is good. And God, the Father, to do that has to abandon him and the Spirit. So think about this. Jesus, who has been one with the Father and Spirit forever, in a sense of oneness that we have no idea of comprehending, on that day was alone, all alone. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, Jesus wasn't asking this because he was confused. Again, like in the garden, he wanted us to read this and say, my God, the reason he's forsaken is me. The reason he's suffering hell is me. That's why he's forsaken. That deserved to be me. But it won't be me because he chose for it to be him. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says that God made Jesus, who knew no sin, to become sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God. Think about this. Here's Jesus, who's perfectly holy and righteous, without sin. He's been that way forever. Forever's a long time. But that day on the cross, the sin of the world was laid on him, and he was filthy. He was filthy with the sin of the world and alone. Wow. No man takes his life, he lays it down willingly. Greater love has no one than this. There's a word for this in Scripture. It's the word propitiation. You find it in Romans and 1 John. The word means that he literally paid for our sins. He suffered our hell. God did not pardon us. In a pardon, a governor or a president can just sign a piece of paper and the charges get dropped and you get a get out of jail free card. No, our sin was not pardoned. It was paid for. Jesus literally paid for the hell that you and I deserve. God poured his holy and righteous wrath against man's sin out on his sinless son, Jesus. I'm going to say this twice. Listen carefully. The one who didn't deserve hell suffered hell for all of us who did deserve it. The one who didn't deserve hell suffered hell for all of us who did deserve it. Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Listen to the words of Isaiah chapter 53, verses 1 to 12. He was despised. Again, these words were written hundreds of years before Jesus was even came to this world. But they exactly describe what Jesus is doing for us on the cross. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. We spat in his face. Surely our griefs he himself bore. Our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God. God was the one smiting him and afflicted. He was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. Why didn't he open his mouth? Because this is what he came for. The whole reason he entered this world is that he could live a righteous life, satisfy the holiness and righteousness of God, and be our substitute, pay our price of hell so we could know God, get to heaven, miss hell. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. He was cut out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, us, to whom the stroke was due. Here's the most incredible verse in the whole Bible, in my opinion. The Lord was pleased to crush him. to crush him, putting him to grief if he would render himself as a guilt offering. Now, let's just get honest. We can be honest, church, can't we? I've got two daughters, two son-in-laws, and 4 grandchildren. And if you ask me to kill one of them to save you, you're a goner. Okay? You're a goner. Ain't gonna happen. But you realize that's exactly what Jesus did? God did for you. He punished his own son, who didn't deserve it, to save somebody who completely deserved it. The Lord was pleased to crush him, not just willing, pleased, putting him to grief if he would render himself as a guilt offering, which is exactly what he did. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering or a present far too small. If we had the whole world to give to him, and we don't, it wouldn't be enough. It'd be infinitely inadequate. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Number 8, Jesus declared his work to be finished. Jesus, after these 3 hours of darkness, Jesus commits himself to the Father and says, "It is finished. I have done what I came to do." In Revelation, I love this verse. Jesus is appearing before John, and he talks about having the keys of death and hell. Jesus went there and brought the keys back. And so Jesus declares himself to be finished. He physically dies. Because it was the Sabbath was coming up, the Jews asked the Romans to go ahead and expedite the deaths of these men. So they broke the legs of the thieves. Why? Again, so they couldn't push up and they would suffocate and die. They go to Jesus, he's already dead. He was almost dead when he got there. But they pierce a spear into his side. Last thing. Finally, number 9, the Roman centurion recognized Jesus. He got it. A centurion is a Roman soldier who led 100 men. So this was likely the crucifixion battalion. See, the Romans did this a lot. And they would do this out on a main highway so that everybody would come by and would be afraid of them. This is what happens if you don't do what the Romans say. And so these guys, no telling how many crucifixions they had seen. But they'd never seen one like this. They'd never seen somebody who willingly submitted to their torture. They'd never seen somebody who would offer his hand and his feet. They'd never seen somebody being killed by them, praying a prayer that God would forgive the very people killing him. They'd never seen anything like this. So Jesus dies. The earth literally quaked when he died. It convulsed. The veil of the temple was massive. It was 3 inches thick of material. You could probably it'd take 2 big pickup trucks and a lot of chains to rip this thing apart. And the moment he died, the temple down the road, that veil split in 2. If you remember, the veil separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is the presence of God, and only a high priest could go back there once a year. The whole point was now anyone under the blood can come into the presence of God. So the veil is split from top to bottom. Also, when he died, as the earth quaked, a bunch of graves opened up, and a bunch of saints were resurrected. Doesn't tell us how many, but there were several, it says, who came back to life. The centurion didn't know about the veil. He didn't know about the people coming back to life. But he knew one thing. He had never seen anybody like Jesus. And so he says, truly, this was the Son of God. If you'll dare to look at who Jesus really is and what he did for you, you'll come to the same conclusion. He is the Son of God. No greater love has ever or will ever be found than his. He didn't have to drink the cup. not for his sake. The Father did not have to crush him. Again, they could have left us to suffer the hell we deserved, but they didn't. If you can find somebody better than Jesus, live every moment of the rest of your life for that person. If you can find somebody who loves you more than Jesus, spend every moment of the rest of your life living for that person. Because of him, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, a holy God can now pass over our sin.